evening, everyone, and welcome to session 2 of Criminal Justice and Public Health course and seminar. I'm speaking to you from Pope Valley, California, where I live. Pope Valley is the occupied and unceded land of the indigenous Wapo peoples, and that is via TUC, which is situated on Mare Island in Vallejo, the occupied and unceded homeland of the Suisun and Karkin American Indians. So in our last lecture, we briefly touched on the collateral consequences of mass incarceration. The effects of these consequences, as we discussed, go well beyond the individual level impacts affecting communities and families. And high rates of incarceration in the US threaten and weaken communities and health of communities while limiting educational attainment, employment, and economic mobility. And that is really the case for many justice-involved people, as well as their families and communities. This week, our reading covers the widening and deep inequality of these consequences that drive disparities, as described by Dr. Miller in his writings. He is our special guest speaker this evening. And a little bit about Dr. Miller. He's an assistant professor in the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration. His research really examines life at the intersections of race, poverty, crime, control, and social welfare policy. His book, Halfway Home, Race, Punishment, and the Afterlife of Mass Incarceration, which is launching this February, is based on 15 years of his research and practice with currently and formerly incarcerated men, women, their families, partners, and friends. I very much look forward to adding Dr. Miller's book to the required reading list for next year's class. I'm also proud to announce that Dr. Miller has recently joined a research collaborative on wrongful conviction between TUC and the University of Chicago. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Miller. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. So I thought it would be cool to have to have a conversation, and I'm bad at Zoom, so maybe I won't call on you. Maybe you just jump in and we just chat as we go. Is that okay? Is it cool if we just talk about this? So I was curious. I saw your readings, and I know you watched the Brian Stevenson TED Talk, which is fantastic. And I'm curious what you all think. So don't feel obligated to have to dig deep into the readings, especially mine. But what when we think about mass incarceration as a public health crisis, like what are the or perhaps if we led with that statement, mass incarceration is a public health crisis, or if we ask the question, like, is mass incarceration a public health crisis? I wonder what you think about that. What comes to mind when you think about mass incarceration and public health, and why might it be? Why is it important for people in public health to think about this question?
Okay, I'll start. For one, we read this article in one of our behavioral classes last semester about mass incarceration and the effects that it has on prisoners. And it really talked about how a lot of them go unheard, and they'll have like a lot of health problems that they'll try to convey, but nobody will really listen to them. None of the staff, not even the healthcare staff that's there, and that's, like, they're literally there for that purpose, to listen to the prisoners and get their concerns heard. And they talked about how this one prisoner was talking about how he was having heart problems, but nobody really paid attention to that, and he ended up having a stroke. Or I think it was either a stroke or a heart attack, I can't remember, but it's just like those things, like within the system, I think we really need to take care of. And it really starts with, first of all, just understanding that is a problem in itself, when prisoners are incarcerated and their health concerns are not being heard.
Yes, that's a terrible situation, and a really insightful observation. Do I pronounce your name Gerline? How do I pronounce it?
That's right,
Gerline?
Darlene.
Gerline, yeah, no, thank you for that. I wonder, what do you, are your thoughts that, it's a question of voice, like listening to people and what they need? Is that, well, that's interesting.
I definitely think we could start there because maybe it's just that the staff doesn't even realize that that's what they're doing, like not listening to the prisoner, is causing this problem. So if they can recognize that like as the first step, I think that would be really good.
Gerline, thanks for that. So what do other people think when you hear that? So on the one hand, there's this question of voice, and I think that's a powerful insight on this problem. There's a scholar, Becky Pettit, who published a book called Invisible Men, in part for this reason. Now, she's a demographer, and I know public health scholarship, public health scholars tend to be quantitative, so this might resonate. And so she counts things, like how many people are in prison, like what do labor rates look like, what are the health effects of incarceration, and she runs something called the Population Study Center out of the University of Texas, Austin. Anyway, she writes this book called Invisible Men for this very question. On the one hand, there's people ignoring, I think, Gerline, as you're pointing out, people just not listening. And on the other hand, there are people who aren't looking to listen. So the entire population is undercounted. So on the employment statistics side of things, Becky Pettit and her mentor, Bruce Western, found in 2000 that if you count prisoners in employment rates, that the nation's unemployment rate increases by 2 full percentage points. So if you count people in prison as people who are unemployed, that the national unemployment rate increases by 2%. The Black unemployment rate, because the mass incarceration, of course, is the targeted incarceration of social groups. In this case, young Black men who are poor. And they use measures like education to get at questions of poverty. But but Black unemployment nationally goes up 7 full percentage points just by counting, just by attending to the actually existing circumstances that people find themselves in. So now what happens if you take it a step further, as Gerline is suggesting, not just counting them, but listening to them when you ask, like going to them and asking, like, what do you need? What are your experiences? And then hearing them when they talk to us, not ignoring their calls when they ask for help in, for example, prison. It's pretty wild. What do other people think? When you hear mass incarceration and public health, why is mass incarceration something that public health practitioners, public health researchers, medical practitioners, medical researchers, and the public, the relationship between mass incarceration and public health, why is this something we should be thinking about?
Maybe this is too surface level, but just thinking about the current events now, the whole COVID-19 outbreak in the prisons, and I'm sure with other outbreaks of different viruses and stuff in the past, that's a public health issue, just with their close quarters and maybe hygiene. Absolutely. Things as good.
Hannah, do I pronounce it Hannah or Hannah? Is it Hannah?
Yeah.
Hannah? Yeah, no, Hannah, that's spot on. So we know that it's something like the second largest concentration of COVID-19 infection, something like that, are in prisons. I mean, it's nursing homes and then prisons, which are increasingly looking like nursing homes, right? With the aging of the prison population, even. So it's a great point. It's not two service at all. Absolutely spot on. It's interesting that there's no national, just like there's no national response to COVID, there's certainly no national plan for COVID in prisons. I think we're on to something interesting. What do you all think? If we keep following this trail, what do you all think?
I think in addition to what Hannah is saying, even now in the state of California, Governor Newsom, his task force to look at COVID-19 vaccine and the distribution, there's still discussion if prisoners should be even included in the second tier or the third tier. So there's not even agreement in California, and I'm sure in other states as well. And also, if you think about the prisoners, once they're released, they're on parole, they may have felony on their record. That's going to prevent them from getting a job. I think of population health, we think of preventive measures. And if you have no, the United States is still a country that has no universal health care.
That's right.
So without health care, how are they going to, access the system to maintain that health or whatever, medical ailments they have, which certainly is probably not being treated very well in the prison system. And that's just going to perpetuate, and, it's going to be in their DNA and it's going to go on for their children, their families, et cetera.
Tina, that's profound. I mean, it's super important if we think about not just on the inside, but also the outside and the connections between the two. So now you've got a population, and from our readings, the things that we know, from this population, we know, for example, things like HIV risk are super high in and among this group. When years ago, 2006, 7, 3, when these first studies were coming out about like HIV risk in prisons, thinking about like global prevalence, when they were thinking about mass incarceration, for example, health risks, we were thinking something like 5 times more likely incidence of HIV infection was 5 times more likely among this population. We now know it's between 2 and 7 times more likely within this population. But this connection, and it's all manner of chronic and communicable diseases: HIV, hepatitis, diabetes, heart disease, and of course mental health issues, which we'll talk a lot about as we're, during our time together. But Tina, this point you raised about the connection to the outside. So now you've got folks who are a medically vulnerable population that are now released at something like 650,000 people a year, between 6 and 650,000 medically vulnerable, if nothing else, folks are going home. And then, your observation, we don't have universal health care, and healthcare is connected to employment. So insurance is connected to employment, and this is a highly, the population faces a great degree of employment instability, for reasons that you raised, but the mark of a criminal record, including labor market exclusions that are completely constitutional, mean that, many folks don't have work. In fact, there was a big study that came out of the Ella Baker Center, and a good proportion of the people, they talked to something like 1,000 people, and close to half of the people they talked to were unemployed 5 years after they got released. 5 years after. So how do you deal with all this illness that generates in the prison? There are also some things that we know from recent studies of prison health. We know that prisoners report worse health in the year after they've spent time in prison than they did when they went in. So we know that we know empirically that prisons, at least based on self-reports, make us sick. They make us sick. And then this is something, I don't know if you all got a chance to check this out or not. Professor Kelly, I only had a chance to look at the list. I didn't get a chance to dig in deeply into the list that she sent me. She sent me so much stuff, which is, you've got a great professor. She's preparing you well, or helping you to prepare well, raising very important things, I think, for us to be thinking about. But I don't know if you had a chance to read Evelyn Patterson's work, who's a sociologist out of Vanderbilt, and she wrote this great paper on the dose response. It's like dose response in mass incarceration or something like that, where she uses demographers use these tables to make predictions about life expectancy and death that are akin to actuarial tables. And she uses this method to estimate the likelihood of death after serving time in a New York State penitentiary. And she finds that for every year that a person serves time in a prison in New York State, they lose a year off their life course. Well, how and why does that happen? How does this happen? So you get maybe perhaps some, Gerline tells us awful level of care in prison, but it's something. And then you get out, and you're inside. And Hannah reminds us that you're medically vulnerable, so you're subject to whatever the disease of the moment is, whether that's hepatitis C, HIV/AIDS, some new strains of MRSA. I can't tell you how many guys I ran into who got MRSA infections while they were inside that would get exacerbated later. And then all these problems that happen, or COVID-19, for example. And then when you get out, you don't have access to healthcare. You don't have access to the few things you had access to when you were on the inside, and get locked out of the labor market. So studies of, so she finds for every year you spend in a New York State penitentiary, you lose 2 years off the life course. But studies but it confirms other studies, epidemiological studies that show that formerly incarcerated people are 11 times more likely to die within 2 weeks of their release than members of the general population during that period when compared to the rest of the population, like the mortality rates. They're 11 times more likely to die during that 2-week period of release. They're 147 times more likely to die from drug overdose, which says something. But they're 11 times more likely to die from any other cause, which is just powerful and strong and interesting, and raises an important question about how are we meeting as this point that Tina's raising around how we're meeting or not meeting their medical needs. It's really quite striking. It's a little bit depressing. We should look at kitten pictures together today. Like we should like focus on something else altogether. Like just change the subject. No, but we're gonna stay here in this depressing place. Just for a little while longer. Okay, so do we agree? Is there a case to make that public health, that mass incarceration should not be considered a public health crisis? Do we feel like there's a case to make for that? And what might that case be? And it's okay to think the opposite. In fact, let's think about this a different way. Instead of it being your opinion, what argument would you make against if you were on the opposite side? Because to do public health is to presume something about population well-being. It's to start from the position that that health is a structural thing, that disparities are things that we want to address. It's in some ways to start from a position of justice, but everybody, or social justice, defined in a very specific set of ways, that people should have access to a set of services. But everybody doesn't start there, right? Like when you go out into the field, people are going to make all kinds of arguments about what people should get services, how and why they should get it, and how and why they deserve it. And so I wonder, what's the opposition to this position that mass incarceration is a public health crisis, that mass incarceration is a concern, should be of concern for public health practitioners? What might we think somebody might say against that?
Well, to play the devil's advocate, and around stigma, I think a lot of people would think, well, prisoners put themselves into prison. So if you think individualistic, how like Americans, we think of our health very individualistic. We don't think of like the whole population. So if you think like that, then you can maybe think, playing the devil's advocate, that, they put themselves in prison. So if their health deteriorates, then that's on them, or it's not an important issue. Or because they're in prison, some people might think, do they deserve healthcare? So it's that stigma, I think, that lacks people who aren't in public health or who are opposed, I think, because as a nation, we feel that healthcare is very individualistic and not thinking about the social determinants of health and other.
That's a great point. It's a fantastic. How do I pronounce your first name?
Mishgan, but
Mishwan.
Mishgan.
Mishgan.
Yes.
Mishgan. Okay. Mishgan. That's a fantastic. I think that's a fantastic point. Especially this question, if we think about like death by overdose, especially, just for a hot second. Remember that statistic that we just shared? It was like people who were released from prison So Tina raised the case about their health needs and to the outside and brought us to the outside in, I think, powerful ways. But I want to stick with this point that you just raised, which is about deservingness. And I want to think about questions of culpability for a second. And so how do we explain all these deaths from drug overdoses within that period? And what position might somebody take about all these deaths from drug overdoses on this period, especially given this point that you raised around, how we think about, and we being a people, how Americans as a people, think about questions of personal responsibility and accountability, especially when it comes to questions of harm of oneself. So, something like, I think I said 147 times more likely, I think it's 127 actually, but 127 times more likely or something like that, to die from drug overdose within those 2 weeks. How do we marshal support? What's the argument? If we throw the personal responsibility card on the table, what's the public health response to a question like that?
Some people are falsely convicted too, so they just there and they just got the short end of the stick, really, and now they have to deal with a prison system and what they don't get from it and get from it. Yeah.
Wrongful convictions, over 2,000, something like 2,700. Professor Kelly can talk about this much more articulately than I can. But something like 2,700 wrongful convictions since 1989. That's just since we've been counting. That's pretty wild. But what about people who did things? What do we do with all these people who actually did stuff? Like people who, were sent to prison for drug possession. They have a drug issue. People who are addicted to drugs, for example, and who get out addicted to drugs. What case do we build for them? What case do we build for people who are dying from these deaths of overdose or dying from deaths of despair? Depression is higher among this group. Mental health problems, of course, as we know, as we've read, are very highly prevalent among this group. Most prisoners, somewhere close to 2/3, have a diagnosable mental health problem. A smaller number, something like 15%, but still much higher than we see in the general population, suffer from severe mental illness. So even deaths of despair. But what happens when those deaths of despair are for a murderer? What happened when those deaths of despair? I need to raise this question and, just to give a warning, we're talking about crime and punishment. So I'll raise the specter of a particular kind of crime that happens to affect many of us. And I'm sorry to raise it, but we must if we're going to talk about crime and punishment. But what about rapists? What about people who harm children? What's the public health case when the personal responsibility card gets dropped, which it does, and it will continue to be, and the person we're talking about aren't innocent, aren't nonviolent drug offenders, right? Nonviolent, non-serious, non-sexual. The non-nons is kind of the colloquial expression, which, by the way, happen to be the people that we concentrate all the criminal justice reform energy on, which, by the way, happen to be less than half the prison. So what happens when we're talking about the other half of the prison? People who committed violent acts, sometimes heinous acts, and they did it. And Hannah, this isn't to take away from your point. You make a powerful point. I mean, 2,700 exonerations since 1989 tells us we don't really know what we're doing. You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of people that we got to let go. And on average, they spend about 9 years in prison. That's 9 years on average as a group, 9 years. Again, Professor Kelly will be able to talk to you about people who've done 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, so many years for things that they did not do. And they were convicted of very heinous crimes, often because of false confessions, often because of bad DNA evidence, often for just a gang of reasons, prosecutor malfeasance, lying police officers. I mean, because Police are people like everybody else. Prosecutors are people like everybody else. They suffer from all the problems that we all suffer from, you know, including having terrible characters. Like that's possible too. That's also possible in that realm. But having said this, what case can we make? Is there a public health case to be made for people that cause harm?
I feel like the attitude towards people who've committed these kind of violent crimes is often just to say, he's a bad person, that's why he did these things. I would never do that because I'm a good person. And so he needs to be separated from society and punished. But when we send these people to prison, we're just punishing them and reinforcing the idea that they're bad people. They're not getting any reinforcement that there's hope for rehabilitation. They're not getting any of the resources for rehabilitation. So when they come out, they're just the same, if not in a worse mentality than they were before. And they're just going to continue to perpetuate these crimes because there hasn't been any address to the original manifestation of these crimes, which is probably just low economic status, a lack of education, lack of healthcare, a lack of a stable housing. Most of these things would have been manifestations to those heinous crimes.
Oh, this is okay. So Sophia's making okay. So I thought you were about to make a moral argument, which is also useful, you know, but you flipped it on me, and you made an argument about public safety, and you made an argument about efficacy, the efficacy of the system itself, and about crime and criminality and the production of criminality and how it gets produced and what these issues are. That's interesting. What do you all think? Is the public health argument? Look, I got. Wait, who's chiming in? Please jump in. Where are you? Who's talking?
Oh, that was, I can wait till you're done with your.
Oh, Tina. Okay. Hey. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Just to add on. Just want to. This is a good conversation. I just want to add on to it. All right. So like, just to add a little bit. Is the public health? So Tina, say what you're gonna say. Don't let this change it, and then let's pick this up. But is the public health argument a public safety argument? Is that the public health argument? Or is there also a separate public health argument that we could be, or is public safety is a health issue too? So I can see that. But is this an argument? Are there other arguments? But Tina, you were gonna say.
I was going to say back to, and apologies, not directly to what the other person just said, but more so that the devil's advocate and what is the opposition to that. And I'm going to talk about resources, that there's only so much resources to go around. Someone mentioned that America, we're individualistic. We got to pull ourselves up by our bootstrap. So those individuals, they're doing self-harm, they're taking drugs. So because of limited resources, I think we're going to use this hierarchy system, and those in the prison system are going to be at the bottom of the matrix, and we're not going to spend our resources on healthcare for those, or mental health care, or drug rehabilitation. Not that I agree with that point.
No. It's all good. This is a judgment-free zone.
But I'm just thinking of what that opposition would be.
What do y'all think?
Just to add on to Sophia's point about public safety, I definitely think that is correlated to public health. I would also say that, the public health of people who have committed heinous crimes, I think also directly affects the public health of people that haven't. And then not only that, but people within the criminal justice system who have done the nons that you were saying, like the non-crimes. So I think it all kind of feeds off of itself, like when you're looking at rates of HIV and things like that. So providing that equitable care to everyone, I think, is really important.
Yeah, this is interesting. This is interesting. So we all so Hillary says we all live together. like really, we're on this plan together. Tina says I hear this argument about resources, but there are always arguments about limits. Hillary has a response, not directly to that, but I think it responds well to that point, which is, but we're all in this together. We're connected. Our fates may be linked here. What do you all, what do others think? Why should you care about this?
Because I think we've been talking about public safety and public health, and I kind of see them as the same thing. Mm-hmm. And then they cannot, they have to coexist. They are one and the same. Without public safety, public health, vice versa. And that's, just like, that's the way I would like frame it.
Professor Kelly tells us that being able to be, that safety and health are connected. No, I think that's a powerful point. I think it's a powerful point. So we've thought a lot about together today mass incarceration as a public health dilemma, and we've thought a lot about physical health, and we've talked a little bit about mental health. We've certainly talked about mortality. I want to jump into the weeds of the administration of health, or the administration of health care, in a slightly, and maybe in a way that we haven't covered, that isn't quite in the readings. And I'm primarily a I'm primarily an ethnographer. The way I do research is through something we call ethnography, which is participant observation, which you all likely already know, and forgive me for being being super basic, but I find it's helpful to have a shared vocabulary. And so I do participant observation. So I go where people are and I do what they do to better understand through my body a set of experiences, and that's how I write about them. And so that's the method I primarily use. I do other methods too, primarily qualitative methods. I've done more demographic, statistical work, but it's not what I prefer to do. What I prefer to do is work with, and is qualitative work with people. I like the texture of the interview, and I like the narrative. It's interesting to me. And so anyway, so what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about, to tell a couple stories about people's lives, and about a set of experiences that I had following people. And the first is from some time ago. It's from 2009. And at the city of Chicago, where I'm from Chicago. I was kind of born here and raised here. I'm in Chicago now. Was in the middle of something they called its 10-year plan to end homelessness. And at this point, it's interesting. There were two studies. I was in the middle of this my study at the midpoint of Chicago's 10-year plan to end homelessness, and the city council had just announced that there was something like 24 homeless families downtown at this time. This is ridiculous. It was utterly ridiculous for them to say this. At the time that I heard the radio broadcast on the local news that there were 24 families that were homeless downtown, I was sitting downtown on a park bench with 6 homeless families. So you mean to tell me, right, that I've got a quarter of the population that I just happen to have found a quarter of the entire homeless population in this one moment. But anyway, so this is the kind of duplicity that that government officials sort of operate under. We know that at the point in time count, there were thousands of homeless people in the city of Chicago. And we know that in 2009, when I was doing this research, we really didn't have super sophisticated ways to count and consider homelessness, not in the ways that we have now. But anyway, we're in the 10-year plan to end homelessness. We're at the midpoint of it. But this was kind of a turning point for the city too, because they realized how entrenched poverty was in the city, and they decided to change the name from the 10-year plan to just the plan to end homelessness, because they realized they wouldn't beat homelessness in 10 years. And so this was about a decade before private developers who were working in tandem with the city put a fence around this area that we call the Triangle. It was a homeless encampment in downtown Chicago under an area called Lower Wacker Drive. And what they did was they put up a fence around it, and they evicted dozens and dozens and dozens of homeless families from really one of few places where they could be that was somewhat warm, in part because Lower Wacker Drive is this strange kind of highway sort of underpass, and there's all these sewers and stuff like that in air vents that keep it a bit warmer than other places. So anyway, I get to the Triangle. It's about 4:30 in the morning. And then I'm looking around and I'm surveying these rows of makeshift tents and clothes and shopping carts, garbage bags, cardboard pallets. And I connected with a staff member from a homeless outreach organization that serve residents of this encampment. This guy was a licensed clinical social worker, and he was really well organized. He kept a duffel bag with socks and McDonald's gift cards for $5. And he had resource lists, and he would hand these out, and he had petty cash, and he would hand these out to the folks that he met. His beat was the Triangle, this encampment. Now, to say something about the ridiculousness of this 24 families statement, at the 2009 official point in time count, which happened just a couple weeks later, and which is part of the reason why they changed it from the plan to the 10-year plan in homelessness to just the plan, was at the official point in time count in Chicago, there were 6,240 homeless people at the point in time count in the city, 24. And so while this figure represents an increase from the year before, it was probably a pretty gross underestimation, because what we know about homelessness, we know that homelessness in many ways is like poverty, that people fall in and out of homelessness in the same way that people fall in and out of poverty each year. So when you think about poverty, it's not the poor and everybody else. It's really pretty static, where you may be considered, you may be poor for 3 or 4 months out of a year. With a more sophisticated understanding in mind, researchers now estimate that homeless people, there are about 76,998 homeless people in Chicago, with this more sophisticated number in mind. So anyway, the sun was going to come up in just a few hours. It was spring by then, but still cold, with pockets of snow, mostly gray slush on the ground. And we waited with the social worker for the next arrival, a Chicago police officer. And he seemed nice enough, right? He was kind. There's a whole literature on what people call, quote, procedural justice. And what procedural justice tells us is that if people perceive the encounter to not be rude, if the officer doesn't escalate the problem by raising his voice, if he doesn't mistreat you, if he operates in some ways that are polite, then the perception of the person who's being handled by the police officer is a little better than somebody who's being treated rudely or something like that when they're arrested. And so they're more satisfied with the encounter, even if they're arrested, even if they're found guilty. And there's a big push for procedural justice, because people find that police officers tend to be really rude, for example. Anyway. So next, after the police officer arrives, so too does a garbage truck that pulls up a few minutes later, and a garbage man who worked for the Department of Streets and Sanitation. And this was our team. So there's the social worker, there's the researcher, me, and I had a research partner. There's the police officer, there's the homelessness outreach worker who would now go work the encampment, the Triangle. And then then there's us. And so we're prepared to go and to follow the social worker who's going to try to sign people up for services. And so with the team assembled, the 5 of us began the work for the day. My partner and I shadowed the social worker as he approached the man he knew from years doing street outreach rather. And he called the man by name, even gently, because he was a very nice guy. He's organized, he's well put together, and he's polite. And the officer's polite too. And the garbage man is polite too. Everybody's nice. I'm a fairly nice guy. My partner's fairly nice. We're all nice people. And here we are going to do street outreach work. So he asked about a pending disability case, which struck me as interesting. And he asked the man about his plan for the night, all while handing out his goods, a new pair of socks, the $5 coupon, a list of programs where the man could get services, and his business card. And so the man shook his head, looked at the social worker, then he looked at me and my research partner, and then he looked at the police officer. Finally, he looked at the garbage truck that the garbage man was driving next to us as we were walking up to people and offering services. It hummed loudly about 10 feet away. The man picked up his bedroll and he left. The client, I suppose, had received a service. We walked a few feet to the next resident, the police officer accompanying our party with the garbage truck inching up as we offered our wares. Now, these encounters were friendly. The social worker knew the guy. He was happy to see him. Everything was polite. Some encounters were much less friendly. One woman cursed at the social worker. She said, "I know what you're doing." Another refused to leave after receiving socks and the McDonald's coupon, at which point the police officer stepped to the front of our party, this kind, nice, polite police officer, and he instructed the garbage man to throw away her bedroll. Sometimes the officer took the lead. Some people had shopping carts, radios, or chairs. These are things that violated a brand new city ordinance that had passed in Chicago that was against, quote, camping in public. The officer and the garbage man threw these items away. So the routine at this point was clear. Accept services and leave the area, or have your stuff tossed or be arrested. Either way, you were going to be removed. That year, I interviewed about 120 people, all of them homeless, all of them displaced. And this was a part of this larger study, an evaluation of the Chicago plan to end homelessness. What was really striking to me, though, and this is why I'm telling you this, is that almost everyone that we met had a pending court case. Almost everyone we met had criminal records for petty larceny, for public urination, for trespassing, for drug use. And this was a part of an era of crime control that we've come to associate with broken windows policing, where men with squeegees were seen as a threat to public safety. And when there was yet another moral panic in the United States about the potential for criminality among the idle poor. We've seen versions of this story concerning formerly enslaved people and so-called welfare queens. The story almost ends in criminal prosecution. And like the first gentleman we met in the Triangle, most folks we encounter had a diagnosable disability. This is the second part. Almost all of them had applied for disability insurance because they needed help. And they're things that we've known for quite a while. So for over 2 decades, or at least we've known that over half the people who reside in American jail or prison live on incomes at or below half the US poverty line. That is to say, that we've known forever that the people that we incarcerate in this country are poor. In fact, one study found that over half of jail residents reported no taxable income in the 3 years before they were sentenced, and that they would have no income at all on the year after they were released. But the relationship between incarceration and homelessness is finally starting to get a little bit of attention, which is good. A recent study from the Prison Policy Initiative finds that people who experience about-a-street homelessness are 7 times more likely to be arrested than members of the general population. And conversely, people who are incarcerated more than once are 13 times more likely to experience homelessness. Another reason why I'm telling you this story is because we know that homelessness drives incarceration. But incarceration really, really, really drives homelessness. So folks who are incarcerated are 13 times more likely to end up on the street if they were incarcerated more than once. And so while I had some idea that illness and incarceration were interconnected because of all the reasons that we talked about today, all the stuff that we cited sort of in our discussion, which we kind of covered a lot of the stats that we read together about that relate to incarceration and questions of public health. And so I knew that these things were interconnected, that illness and incarceration, and for example, disease prevalence, incarceration and chronic illness. I had no idea of the extent. A report came out in 2012 to show 1/3 of all infections for communicable diseases in the United States had passed through a US jail or prison in the year before. And of course, as we discussed, prisoners are many times more likely to have HIV and hepatitis and all these other things. And that mental health studies reveal that up to 15% of incarcerated people are diagnosed with a severe mental illness, with 64% of jail residents reporting a diagnosable mental health problem, as we discussed. So we know prisons make us sick. And we know the studies show us that people who are incarcerated report worse health than they were before they went in, and the effects on life expectancy and all this. But there's something else that's wild. The prisons and jails and detention centers that we employ to cage people that we're afraid of also produce disabling conditions. But the relationship between incarceration and disability gets much less attention. So many people that we encountered over this time had a diagnosable disability, and so many of their disability claims were rejected, denied, despite the fact that it's so high, that the outreach organization that I was following had to hire full-time attorneys to fight the disability rejection, the claims, the rejection of disability claims. Now, what was striking to me was that the people that we encountered needed an attorney at all. The inability to work and their medical needs seemed clear to anyone paying attention. I interviewed one couple in an encampment just south of the one I'm talking about now. This is in the South Loop. So the encampment I'm talking about is in the Loop. If you go about 2 miles south. I interviewed another couple, a homeless man and a woman. Both had arrest records. The woman rocked in a makeshift tent and spent most of her days talking to herself. So it's clear she had a mental health problem. At some point, she started a practice of lighting their tent on fire each night. Her partner asked the outreach worker for help. It's like, yo, she's lighting the tent on fire. We need a place to stay. We have nowhere to be. We're out here homeless. But what could the outreach worker do? I learned the woman was arrested for arson a few days later. So she got arrested. And I learned subsequently after that this same woman had been denied for disability, which she applied for because of a mental health condition. And she had already been denied twice. So I'd like to ask you all what you think of this. What do we think about this strange relationship between poverty and incarceration and between poverty and disability? But before you start talking to me about, in response to my question, which, let me see, how much time do we have? Where's that? I'm sorry, you're muted.
Sorry, you think I would learn by now. We have until 6 p.m. tonight, and we can take a break sometime in between.
Okay, good. Okay. But I mean with me, like I have an hour and a half, right? So like I have, okay, good,
Yes.
okay, good. All right. So before you do this, I'd like you to do something. Can I ask you to do something? Is this okay? I want you're all on computers. I want you to open a Word document, and I want you to think about this story I just told you. And I want you to journal for 1 minute. Do you have a Word document open? I want you to journal about the relationship between incarceration and poverty. Let's start right now. If you're more comfortable, you can turn off your cameras for the minute, and then I'll tell you when to come back on. All right, we're back. Okay, I want to know what you talked about because we tried not to eavesdrop. It was tempting. We really wanted to, but we didn't do it. What were you all talking about?
In terms of incarceration and disability, like what you were saying about the woman who was arrested for arson, but it was obvious that she had a mental illness. Mm-hmm. It's just we just talked about how it's really hard to get mental health help, even for people who have insurance. It's expensive and they make it hard. And so you know, for people who are homeless or previously incarcerated, they don't have the resources that most like normal people have. And so if it's already hard for normal people, then it's going to be extra hard for them. So it just fuels the cycle of their mental illness just being untreated.
Yeah, it's powerful.
We also kind of talked about it as a cycle, and then going back to like once you're in prison and you get out of prison, there are so many like red tapes you have to go through. Like if you want to restart your life, rehab, if you want to go back to school, you know, you can't take out federal loans because you've been incarcerated. You have to report your criminal activity when applying for jobs. And if you can't get jobs, how are you supposed to start a life? So then some people, that is homelessness. And then I think someone in my group, I think it was Leslie, talked about how in Long Island, maybe there was like some of the homeless people there, they would like do petty crimes that they knew would be like 3 months around the winter time just to like get a warm place to sleep at night. So there's just so many factors that kind of keep it as a revolving door.
It's powerful. Yeah. What did other groups discuss? We heard from Hannah and Sarah. What did other groups discuss?
Something that was mentioned in my group, Sophia had mentioned it, and I never really thought about that, was that prisons are privatized and they profit, they're for profit. So it's kind of a cyclical thing where people of low socioeconomic status go in and they're already below poverty and it's really hard for them. So they are most likely, sometimes they go in there because they can't pay for the fines. And so like for someone, Andrea was saying in my team, she was saying how it's a crime for them because they can't pay for the fine. So they end up going to jail. Whereas maybe someone who is in higher socioeconomic status, they can pay for that fine and they don't go to jail and they don't go through that cycle. But then once you are in prison, then it's a for profit. So when you call to just talk to your family member, you're paying for that, for the meals, for the snacks, all that you have to pay for. And that's just another like adding on.
This is such a important point, you know. Yeah, such an important point. It's kind of the basis for bail reform on some level, right? Like people having discussions about this, and fine and fees reform of court fines and fees. You know, people owe on average thousands of dollars when they get out, almost all of which they have to pay. This is a powerful point. What others think? Any other thoughts?
So I was actually in Hannah's group, and just going back to them arresting the lady for arson. So I guess it's like a system-wide failure because they didn't try to understand the underlying cause of she's having mental problems. Instead, they put her in prison, and I guess the system is more focused on punishment rather than prevention. Like they could have easily tried to understand that she was having mental health problems and gotten her resources for that. Instead, they put her in, I guess, more social disconnected in prison, and that drives more of her health, mental health condition. And yeah, it just comes down to like the system being a failure, I think.
Yeah, these are yeah, these are all super important points. I want to pivot for a second from the front end of the carceral state where we've been hanging out for a minute. You know, this is a great point. Like observing the different places where the system breaks down, you know, the rejection of disability claims, for example, the inability to see the root causes of crime, maybe. I think this is the point that you're raising here. Some question about which groups should be activated at what point. So there's maybe something to think about in relation to the complexity of dealing with an issue like this. I mean, is the answer housing? You know, if you have someone who's burning down housing, even if it's a tent, this isn't to say that the problems aren't complicated, but the response can't always be incarceration, can it? I mean, this can't always be the response. Does this woman deserve punishment? And she clearly has a mental health problem. She clearly qualifies for disability. Why was her application denied twice? Why do you need an attorney to fight the denial of your disability benefit if you're homeless? These are all sorts of, and in what ways does that help this kind of revolving door of arrest and rearrest and arrest and rearrest? So in some ways, we're kind of in a hybrid place, the front end and the back end. You know what I mean? Like you're out in community, but you're in, and you know, like what's happening with you. But for the sake of the argument that we'll make, let's say this is the front end, and let's think about that as a spigot to arrest. Now let's move to the back end, even though it's not static. And I'd like to say that the way we think about incarceration and recidivism and punishment in the prison, sometimes you all didn't do this, but I'm saying like the general discourse around it treats it as if these are static sort of situations, as if the trajectory is linear, you're in or you're out, as if it's a off on switch, as if reentry is different from punishment, as if incarceration is different from reentry, as if these things don't happen in ways that are more fluid. We have plenty of static categories for plenty of things. This is one of them. But let's shift our attention for a hot second, knowing that it's much more fluid than this. For the purpose of analysis, let's keep it static. And let's say we've been thinking a lot about the route in. Let's now think about what happens when you come home, even though everybody we talked to has been out already. But for the sake of the analysis, let's just say. And let me tell you a different story. This time, I'll try to do this without my notes, though I prefer to use notes. but I'll do my best because we're short on time. So I was struck by all this interesting front end stuff. You know, homelessness, the relationship between incarceration and homelessness, the way that these things operate as a route into the system, the way we label poverty crime, for example, the way we labeled mental health conditions crime. For example, the way we made negative health outcomes criminal in this case. For example, the many arrests for homeless people, for example, who have no place to use the bathroom, for things like public urination. Well, where are they going to go? Or the multiple arrests that I'd see. I met one man who had been arrested 14 times for trespassing. He was homeless for 10 years. His last arrest was for trespassing in a public housing unit. And he had 3 rocks in his pocket. So they gave him possession with intent to sell, because 3 was enough for them to decide that he was a dope dealer instead of a drug user, which made all the difference in the length of sentence. You get a 1 to 3 for possession at this time. You get a 3 to 5 for distribution at this time. Okay, but that's not the story I want to tell you. I want to tell you a different story. This is a story of a family. So I moved to Detroit. I took my first job at the University of Michigan. And I'm at the University of Michigan. And in fact, I meet Professor Kelly while I'm still at the University of Michigan. So it's anyway, but so I take this job at the University of Michigan, and I start a study because I'm interested in how these things all interrelate. And not, my work isn't on homelessness. It just so happens that you can't study poverty. You can't study crime without studying poverty. You can't study punishment without studying the experiences of the poor and poor people, because so much of the prison targets poor people. I mean, it's something like, race disparities are egregious. Black people are 5 times more likely to be incarcerated. Latinx folks represent 20% of the prison, but something like 14% of the population. If we go to immigrant detention, Latinx folks represent over 80% of people in immigrant detention centers, and they don't represent over 80% of all undocumented immigrants that move through the country, of course. If you're in a place like California, where you all are, if you go to a jail or prison, you'll notice the overpopulation of Hmong, Laotian people, for example, Filipinos, poor Filipinos. So the groups that we otherize, and if you live on a reservation, you'll recognize that you're actually more likely to be killed by a police officer than a Black man would be. But so much of your population has been diminished, and there's so little attention paid to indigenous people in this country. So I appreciate the land recognition that Professor Kelly gives us, that we don't really pay attention, though those statistics are readily at hand. But anyway, the population, so racial disparities in incarceration are egregious, awful, terrible. Class disparities, and I'm not saying that this is a class question. This is not my point. I'm not telling you that race doesn't matter and that you need to pay attention to class, because I don't think you can detangle these two so neatly. But while racial disparities are 5 to 1, let's say, Black to white disparities, poor people represent well over 80% of American jails and prisons. Poor people broadly defined, poor whites. If you live in a segregated poor white community, your interactions with the police look very similar to people who live in segregated poor Black communities. But we're so racist that we think mass incarceration is a Black problem and not a national one. We're so racist that we've conflated criminality with Blackness, that we think that mass incarceration stops at the threshold of the Black family. I'm on a tangent, actually. I shouldn't be, but I am, so I'm just gonna finish it, which is, there's a study in 2016 that looked at the arrest trajectories of people. We're gonna get off arrest, actually. We're gonna come to reentry. This is the point, we're gonna make this pivot, but I gotta finish this point. Which is, there's a study in 2016 that used a representative sample that showed of people using the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, which samples about 20,000 people a year, something like that. So it's a representative sample of youth in the United States. And they asked the question, like, have you been incarcerated, and they track administrative data and stuff like that. So it's a longitudinal sample. It's a representative sample is what I'm trying to say. And 39% of Black boys will be arrested before they turn 23. That's what they found. That's a lot of boys. This is for a non-traffic violation. I say boys because 23 is, if you're 23, you're young, and you're arrested before you turn 23. So I would call you young. I would say young men or something like that. But many have been arrested as boys. In fact, when I was doing my work, folks started getting arrested. The average age of first arrest was 14. So we are talking about boys, largely boys. 39%, but let's say young men or something. 39% of Black young men will be arrested before they turn 23. Half, certainly boys, of that figure before they turn 18. But I'm sorry, 39%. I said 39%, right? No, 49%. I'm sorry, 49% of Black boys will be arrested before they turn 23. But 39% of white boys will be arrested for a non-traffic violation before they turn the age of 23. 1 in 2 Black women has a currently incarcerated loved one. It's like 44%. Has a loved one that's currently in an American jail or prison. But 1 in 8 white women has a loved one that's currently, right now, sitting in an American jail or prison. And so while white people are disproportionately represented when you compare them to Black people in this country because we're so racist, if you let every Black person free, if you let every Latinx person free, if you let every Cambodian, Laotian, Filipino, every indigenous American, everybody from the Pacific Islands free, we still have one of the largest prisons in the world. But we're so racist that we think mass incarceration is a Black problem. It's pretty wild. There are nearly 1 million white men in prison right now. It's pretty wild. It's pretty wild. Oh, that's a digression. That's too long of a digression, but it is one. Here's the point. Now let's go to the other side of this. So in other words, this is an American dilemma. So for people who wonder why all of us should be concerned about this, one reason might be because it affects all of us. A recent study shows that over half of all Americans have a loved one who at some point in their life has been incarcerated. But we typically only think about racial disparities because so many Black folks, something like 2/3 have. Does this make sense? This is also how systemic racism works. It works in such a way that we conflate not just the negative stuff, but the negative systemic effects of a thing with specific populations. But that's not the point of what I'm talking about today. I want to tell you a different story, focusing on disability, and this time on the outside. And I want to tell you about Ronaldo in June. So Ronaldo, these are fake names, is a man who I meet at the Detroit Detention Center. This is the centralized lockup facility for a period of time for all people who got arrested in the city of Detroit. Now, Detroit's got a gang of problems, and one of the problems that they had was human rights abuses in police station lockup facilities. People were dying in police station lockup facilities. Police were arresting crime witnesses to crimes. Police were arresting family members of people who were suspected of having committed a crime. Police were holding people in lockup facilities with mini cells with 1 or 2 working lights and 1 or 2 working toilets, meaning every time somebody had to go use the bathroom when in a lockup facility in the city of Detroit, the police would have to take them on what's called movement. So you have to move them from the cell with no working toilet over into a cell with working toilets. People weren't being fed for 30 hours at a time. So what happened was the state of the federal government put them under a consent decree. And they say, you're going to have a federal monitor. We're going to watch how you do lockup facilities. In response to this, the state of Michigan came into the city and said, you're no longer responsible for your lockups. We're going to take over your lockups because you don't know how to do it. And so they set up a centralized lockup facility. So anybody who got arrested in the city of Detroit will go to this one place called the Detroit Detention Center. Okay, so I set up shop in the Detroit Detention Center because I was curious about all these things that I was learning when I was doing my work in Chicago. I was like, yo, okay, what happens in another city? What's going down? What's life like for people when they go home? This is kind of my chief interest. And I met a man while I was sampling people named Ronaldo, who was just about to get out of the Detroit Detention Center. Ronaldo had been in and out of prison for a number of reasons. The reasons for this discussion aren't really all that important. But he had been to jail or prison many times for many reasons. What's more important is that Ronaldo had 3 sisters. And what's more important is that those 3 sisters were all broke. And what's more important is that Ronaldo was broke too. And because he had a criminal record, it was very hard for him to get a place to stay. So the 3 sisters, all of which lived in different suburbs of Detroit. Detroit's a very interesting kind of place. There's the city, and then there was flight, and so these suburbs were formed all around the city, and so there are all these suburbs in and around Detroit, and the sisters each had homes in different places in Detroit. And what they would do is they would take turns caring for Ronaldo. Every time Ronaldo would come home from prison, one of the sisters would take it on as a shift. They would provide for him, and what they would do is they would pool their resources so that the sister who was taking care of Ronaldo would have enough to take care of Ronaldo and also have enough to take care of herself. And there's this beautiful sort of thing that I learned spending time with them about the use of deep freezers. They would in times of plenty, they would freeze meat and keep it in the deep freezer, freeze vegetables, freeze stuff. And when Ronaldo would get out, the sisters would bring the extra from their deep freezers to the sister's house. So there was always some food for Ronaldo. It was beautiful and powerful. Well, it was June's turn to care for Ronaldo. June was the oldest sister. And it was June's turn to care for Ronaldo because June's sister Sophia would have been up for the shift, but June's sister Sophia is disabled, and June's sister Sophia's disability benefits had just been cut. And in fact, her disability benefits were not only cut, but her food stamps were cut because there was a general, like in the state of Michigan, the food stamps for seniors had been cut for whatever reason in about 2014. So she can't care for Ronaldo. June, who cared for him the last time he went to prison, was up to care for him again. Now everybody's bringing June food from their deep freezers, Ronaldo, so that Ronaldo and June's family can have enough to eat. But June has a disability. She was an auto worker, and she injured her back, like a slip disc or compressed disc or something like that. And she just had a surgery because she was in constant chronic pain. And she got disability benefits too that weren't cut in this moment. June lived with a husband who used to be a forklift operator. Her husband injured his back at work. He had a work injury. He could no longer operate the forklift. He couldn't get disability because he hadn't been injured for over 2 years. Workman's comp had run out after about 6 months. I met them a year after that. He hadn't gotten a check from the employer for a year. So here's 2 people with a disability caring for Ronaldo. 1 income, 1 disability check to go around the house. But it wasn't just them. June and her husband also looked after their granddaughter because their granddaughter, who was 18 at the time, well, 17 and finishing high school, had gotten into an argument with their daughter and needed a place to stay. She said they couldn't see eye to eye. Well, it turns out that the granddaughter also had a disability. She had cerebral palsy and another disease that I don't remember the name of. It was anyway. She was born with a particular disease that you know does stuff. So she also has a disability. So here's Ronaldo, who cannot work, who needs his sisters to care for him, who lives in this house where 3 people in this home have a disability, and there's just one income. This seems like a wild, ridiculous, awful story about a family that is facing all kinds of tragedy, and you know, could be written off as an anecdote. But I followed 90 people who were released from that detention center that year. And of the 90 people I followed, every person in my study either had a disability themselves or they returned to a home where their lover or somebody in their family who lived in that home had a disability. In fact, a full 19% of all Detroit residents have a disability diagnosis. This tracks with the 43% poverty rate for Detroit children, which is an improvement over years before when the poverty rate was higher. Here's my question for you. What do we make of all this disability in these family systems? What role does public health play? What can we do? Those are my questions for you. What I'd like for you to do is I'd like you to think about these questions. So I want to send you off into your small groups for our last journal exercise together. So Professor Kelly, if we could send them off into groups again. And I'd like for you, before you go into your small group though, to spend 1 minute right now journaling. So let's start the journal exercise now. And then in a minute, we'll send you to your groups. All right, we're back. So instead of asking you just about this set of relationships, I want to return to the case for public health. You all had a chance to chat together a little bit, but I wonder, what can we do about this? Does public health have a role? And what do you think the role is?
What we talked about in our group is kind of just having more people in public health and like social workers and people to like go out there and people that like know about this kind of stuff and care about others, people well-being and mental health, like, you know, a more holistic point of view of a person and kind of doing things to help with like preventative care, like preventive, like mental health services. And we talked about just like having more people in this like industry of public health.
In my group, we kind of talked more about like providers in terms of like insurance and work comp cases, because I have a lot of experience working with work comp, and it's always really, it's like a really long and tedious process. And it's, I've seen a lot of patients that go through the work comp system and just don't, or get their claims denied because they didn't check all the boxes, or they don't really have the time to do the things that are required for work comp. So maybe policy changes, I'm not really sure what, but policy changes to streamline that process and make it easier for people who have disabilities to file their claims.
These are great points. Both great points.
And then going off of both of those, like going off like work comp, like often that's like physical injury, and like going back to the lady who was arrested for arson, like, yeah, if you saw her on the street, you would probably like, for sure that woman has a mental health illness right now. But that's hard to prove, you know, like it's easier to prove physical disability, you know, you could send doctor's notes and stuff like that, but like the woman who was arrested for arson, like she probably didn't have a therapist who had clinical notes to send to government to get workers' comp or whatever. I don't know how that works, but you know what I mean? It's just harder to prove mental illness than physical.
Any final thoughts? Any other thoughts?
We didn't talk about this in our group, but I used to do insurance audits and workers' comp audits. And we did kind of talk about it. Our society is built off we're a capitalist society. So it's about income and making money, unfortunately. And our society pushes a lot of us into poverty in one way or another. And I think that's our main issue, that, you know, we're all thinking about money and, you know, success and succeeding, but everybody, the way that the system is set up, we're not all gonna make the money or have the money. And even workers' comp and insurance claims, they don't want to pay those out. Disability, they're fighting not to approve disability. They're not fighting to help people and spend money. They're trying to spend as less money as they can. So I think that's like the main problem with our society.
Well, we're beyond the end of our time together. This has been great. For me, I don't know, you all might feel very differently, but I appreciate all your comments. They've been very insightful and helpful. And I think you all are the group that should tackle this. If there's one takeaway that I hope to leave you with, it's that mass incarceration shows up in every aspect of social life, including every aspect of health and public health practice. From folks who are going to think about health policy and for example, tackling the dragon of disability policy and questions of disability benefits, streamlining processes, thinking about who gets disability, eligibility questions, sorts of things. This is important. For people who think about health insurance, this is a real question. For people who think about workmen's occupational health, the well-being of employees, this is important. For people who think about the spread of viruses and communicable diseases like COVID-19, like HIV/AIDS, like hepatitis, like heart disease or chronic conditions. For people who are interested in mental health, policy and practice, mass incarceration affects it. And so you're the group to take this question on. You're the right people to be having this conversation with. And as you think about how to improve the health and well-being of populations, which is the purview of public health, I think it's very important that you also consider the role of the criminal justice system in exacerbating poor health and poor health outcomes. And perhaps that we might be able to think about new ways that public health might improve population health and well-being through targeted interventions, for example, with these various groups. So anyway, thanks so much for your time. It was great to meet you. And Professor Kelly, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Miller, for reminding us that, first of all, for this amazing and powerful discussion that you've led. And you've, once again reminded us that mass incarceration touches us all in some way. It's just gets to everything. And this was a really powerful discussion, in addition to underscoring the collateral consequences of mass incarceration and the connection to public health. You've illuminated the relationship between poverty and that of disability to mass incarceration. And I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to hear you highlight these relationships through your impactful stories of the currently and formerly incarcerated people and their families and their loved ones. And I've heard so many important points and arguments from the group tonight, the group discussion this evening, and much appreciation to all of you for making me think. This is good for me too. I love this whole discussion and for sparking this thought-provoking conversation.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care and have a great evening.